Okay, welcome. This is going to be a contextualized reading of Act 1 of Shakespeare's The Tempest. I'm going to break in with some sort of an initial sort of guiding questions and thoughts, and then we'll dig right into the play. There is a general introductory lecture that I gave earlier related to colonialism. And so just to let folks know who might not be taking my Shakespeare class this summer, I'll be referring quite a bit to Aimé Césaire because we're going to be reading his A Tempest next. And Aimé Césaire also wrote a book on the discourse on colonialism. And so the idea of colonialism and Euro-Christianity is going to inflect this contextualized reading as it has all of my contextualized readings this summer. So let's dig in here. A couple of things to think about as guiding thoughts for the play is first of all, Prospero is this magical wizard, and the main character of the play. He's depicted in different ways. He can be depicted as a tyrant, as a loving father. I feel in some ways mistakenly, as I said in my earlier lecture, as a figure, a voice for Shakespeare the person in retirement, although you might contest me on that. But one of the things that he does with his magic is he performs a miracle. And if you remember back to my contextualized readings of Richard II, I talked a lot about political theology, and I had read some famous passages by this conservative legal theorist, German legal theorist named Carl Schmitt, who has a dubious kind of career as a Nazi, but nevertheless remains influential. And so part of the reason for bringing him back up again is that I've, in my contextualized readings, used various thinkers from around the 1950s, whether it is Aimé Césaire or it's Ernst Kantorowicz for The King's Two Bodies, or Carl Schmitt, or Wilson Knight, which is, he was writing a little bit earlier, but the last essay he did on Hamlet is from the 50s. And so we're looking, one of the things I'm interested in when thinking about criticism, because it's my job to talk about Shakespeare criticism in this course as well, is to think about how critics have their own motivations that are related to their own time period. And that's what we do when we're interpreting plays to put them on as a stage direction, for example, or as actors acting in plays and trying to find ways that we can make the characters speak to our own times. And so this interpretive process is going on all the time. But when we look at things about 50, 70 years old, we can see a little bit more clearly what was going on for the motivations in their cultural moment, and then the ways that they're interpreting Shakespeare as well. So Prospero is performing kinds of miracles with his magic. And Prospero is often seen as a kind of, if not, Christ-like type of figure who bestows a kind of grace. And so grace, or Euro-Christian concept of grace, is going to be underlying throughout the play. That's something to be thinking about, especially notions of forgiveness as we get towards the end of the play. And the question of grace versus works was very much part of the cultural moment at the time, when we think about the post-Protestant Reformation moment and the theologies of grace versus work. Calvinist theology and the Protestant Calvinist theology was especially more prevalent in Shakespeare's time, and than say Luther, for example, although we know that Luther's ideas have their grounding in the Wycliffe Bible as well, which is partly why we think historically, this is Wycliffe Bible from the late 1300s, laid a lot of the groundwork for the reception of Protestantism in England. And so Luther and Wycliffe are not far behind, but Calvin is definitely an influence, and Calvin has a kind of emphasis on works. So how, in other words, like how do we show the state of being saved, right? Because there's not a lot of overt direct Christian language here, but there's a lot of Christian humanism going on in The Tempest. And Prospero's performing this kind of miracle. And this guy, Carl Schmitt, said that in law, the state of exception, when we don't know the state of emergency, when we don't know what's going on, that's equivalent to the miracle in theology. And a miracle isn't just a miraculous event in a general sense. It's actually thought of as you have fate and history sort of moving in one direction, and there's a break in from the divine, right? That somehow there's a God type figure who breaks the rules of nature and temporality, history, all of that stuff to make some sort of miraculous thing happen. That's what the miracle is. So we open this play with Prospero performing a kind of miracle. What do I mean? Well, the one thing is it's this storm. So we're not meant, just to be very clear, as I think viewers or the audience of the play, at the opening, we open in the midst of a storm on a boat. We don't know yet that Prospero has been the one who's conducted the whole thing. So that's just very clear from it. It's just a straight reading of the play. But then we quickly find out within Act 1 that Prospero has devised all of this. And so he has this kind of grand design of a plan. Sometimes Prospero has been set as the only figure in a presentation of Shakespeare's play, where he's literally the other characters are his puppets, for example. So the play really does revolve around Prospero. The island then becomes a kind of state of nature, a state of exception, a place of exception, where he has brought this boat and these other people in to sort of teach them a lesson, or to eventually leave the island. Now that's a question that's going to be going on throughout the play, because he refers at one point to Fortuna, but he also seems to have planned this all along, to bring this boat in. So how did he find out about the boat? That's just one of the things that Shakespeare brilliantly leaves open to interpretation. Another theme we want to think about throughout the play is Caliban's development of rhetoric and his sincerity or insincerity with grace and a state of conversion. There's a really nice essay I might let my students have about Caliban's insincerity. But is Caliban, do we believe that by the end of the play that Caliban has converted, that he's going to be a good Christian? Sycorax, the witch from the play, is going to be a reference to Medea, and probably from Ovid in the play. And I think that that's important because, at least in my general introduction, I didn't mention Medea or the story of Medea as in any of the sources. So I just wanted to highlight that there. Jumping all the way toward the end of the play, we're not too worried about spoilers here, is the last line of the play, "Let your indulgence set me free." Thinking about that not in terms of just like the audience being grateful and clapping, which is what Prospero is asking for, in a kind of echo to Puck or Robin Goodfellow at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, for example. We'll see that kind of a capped ending, but also with that kind of resonant word indulgence, and what indulgences meant in the kind of theological or political theological era of the time. The use of enchantment or magic as a defense of liberal arts and free speech. That's a theme that you might think about in this play. But also enchantment being related in somehow to paganism and to incantation. So what we see with Ariel the spirit, who again acts as a kind of Robin, we can see as a parallel to a Robin Goodfellow or a Puck as well. In the context of growing Puritanism in England, so we know that James I is the king when the play is put on, but just after he passes and his son James II takes over, the context of James I's demonology, so he wrote a demonology, or a book about witches and witchcraft, which you could check out if you were doing more research into the play and into the context of the era. Also, Jean Bodin, who's a French thinker who writes about sovereignty, also writes a book called On the Demon Mania of Witches. So theology, witchery, witchcraft, magic, that's all very much tied into politics and political conceptions of the time period here. We could ask, is Shakespeare presenting a solution to the problem of political theology, in naming, in the sense that liberal secular humanists have seen secular humanism and the development later on of the democratic Enlightenment experiments like the United States and the French revolutions. There is a tale or a narrative that liberal secularists have told that there was a break away from church and a religion into a secular society, and we've moved away from superstition, away from magic, away from enchantment, that modern life is, as Max Weber said, disenchanted. Is Shakespeare presenting the liberal arts or a certain version of magic as a kind of solution to the problem of theology and the state being mixed together? That's just a question I can leave open to you all. Another question we might think about as we read the play is the forgiveness of the end comedy sincere? So just as we ask whether or not Caliban is sincere, if we read the end of the play as just a comedy, is it sincere or is it satirical? We might think throughout the play of cannibalism, as I mentioned in my general introduction, cannibalism and civilization, of Montaigne and his essay on cannibals, and blemmies or fictional, fantastic creatures that don't exist, that were people nevertheless at the time thought existed, people with faces in their chests and no heads, that you can look up, these monsters that were reported to have been seen in the so-called New World. Another thing we want to think about just for historical context is Madawaska, or who is Amunut, or also known as Pocahontas, and I put that in quotes, who was a Powhatan woman who was involved in Jamestown. She marries this guy Rolfe, John Rolfe, in 1614, and John Rolfe was part of that shipwreck that the Tempest is kind of is loosely based on, or in reference to. She comes to England, and she's known as Lady Rebecca, and she marries Rolfe in 1614. James I gets mad at Rolfe because Madawaska, I'm going to use her real name instead of Pocahontas, which means little girl, so it's a diminutive name, but Madawaska would have been doing a diplomatic mission, and women were the politicians for for the Native American groups that were being involved with the English. And like many of political alliances, a marriage was supposed to solidify a kind of alliance. Now, that's not exactly how it played out in the colonies because of the Euro-Christian supremacy that the English people had of themselves. We know that Madawaska does not live very long after she's in England. Has a couple kids, but she's important to note because she was in attendance for at least one telling of the Tempest. Now, we don't know what she thought of it or whether or not she knew that it was in part based on John Rolfe's um, uh, um, part in the shipwreck and the Bermudas of earlier in his life of 1609. But nevertheless, an interesting thing and important to remember that native peoples from the so-called New World, native people of Turtle Island, went to England. Sometimes they were forcibly shipped through slavery, which is not talked about enough, Native American slavery, but also as diplomats, right, which would have been this section. So imagining at the end of Shakespeare's career that we're having Native Americans in the audience as well. Just something to think about. Okay, let's continue on with Act One from the start here. So we begin on a ship in a storm, but the rest of the play is on an island. We're meant to believe that the storm is real, but we later find out it's all been Prospero's doing. It's interesting that Shakespeare gives us a class leveling situation right off in this play. In other words, he's waited, or in other plays, he's waited till quite late in the play. But in this play, right off, the boatswain is snarky towards Gonzalo. So think about Hamlet, right? Think about the gravedigger scene with Hamlet. That comes late in the play. Even the underplot, the so-called subplot of A Midsummer Night's Dream with Peter Quince and the player guys, that kind of happens a little bit later. And eventually we get like a lot more of their dialogue towards the end of the play itself. And we can think about interactions with the trickster or the jester figure, not just Trinculo in this book, but in King Lear, for example, as shifting places with King Lear late in that play. And so right off, it seems like Shakespeare's drawing on some of his devices in this play that are well known, but he's throwing us right into it. Shakespeare's obviously researched some nautical terminology here. We don't, so far as we know, think that he ever really spent time on ships, but he's using language of sailors. And in this, he kind of codes a kind of sailor speak here. And when we think about pirate speech and things like that, yar, matey, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, it comes. We get some of that from later English people who were fascinated with pirates, but I think that we can see a shift towards that kind of attention to a particular class of working class people here. So pretty soon, this is all in Act 1, Scene 1. We get this interaction with Gonzalo and the boatswain. The boatswain says, Gonzalo says, "Good, yet remember whom thou hast aboard. Remember that you have nobility on board, right?" And the boatswain says that he has good, yet remember whom none that I love more than thyself, right? So there's no one on this boat that I love more than myself. You are a counselor, and if you can command these elements to silence and work the peace of the present, we will not hand a rope more. Use your authority. If you cannot, give thanks you have lived so long, and make yourself ready in your cabin for the mischief of the hour, if it's so hap. Cheerily, good hearts, out of our way, I say. And so we get this kind of reversal where we get the boatswain commanding Gonzalo, who is annoyed and talks about having him hanged if they ever get out of the situation. So this is all happens within the first few pages of the text, and then we get the boat splitting up when we go to Act 1, Scene 2. This is going to be long and take us throughout the rest of the act. So shifts to Prospero and Miranda on the island. And um, Prospero has to. One of the things about this play is that because the plot is mostly made up by Shakespeare, in some ways it's easier, I think, as I said in my general introduction, it's easier for newcomers to read The Tempest because they don't have to read about English royal history, for example. At the same time, because there's so much contextual dubious stuff around colonialism, we need to pay attention to the inherent colonialism and power dynamics and violence that's going on in this play, particularly in the treatment of slaves. But in making up his own plot, Shakespeare here has set up the situation where the context has to be explained by the characters in the play. And he does this by having Miranda and Prospero talking about how they came to be on the island in the first place. Miranda opens here saying to her father, "If by your art, my dearest father, you have put the wild waters in this roar, allay them, the sky, it seems, would pour down the stinking pitch, but that the sea, mounting to the welkin's cheek, dashes the fire out. Oh, I've suffered with those that I saw suffer. A brave vessel who had no doubt some noble creature in her, dashed all to pieces. Oh, the cry did knock against my very heart. Poor souls, they perished. Had I been any god of power, I would have sunk the sea within the earth, or ere it should go the good ship so have swallowed, and the frauding souls within her." Prospero says, "Be collected, no more amazement. Tell your piteous heart there's no harm done." "Oh, woe the day," says Miranda. And Prospero, "No harm." So this is kind of like back and forth. Like, he's a pretty harsh character. That's the way I tend to read him. "I've got everything under control. Check it out. No harm. I've done nothing but in the care of thee." So he doesn't quite say whether he did the storm or not here to Miranda. He's a little bit dubious. We find out later on when he's talking to Ariel that he indeed did cause the storm. He says, "I've done nothing but in the care of thee, dear one, thee, my daughter, who art arrogant of what thou art, not knowing of whence I am, nor that I'm more better than Prospero, master of the poor cell, and thy no greater father." Now, father and daughter relationships, we can go right back to A Midsummer Night's Dream. This is a theme throughout Shakespeare in general, our parents and their relationships to children. So we could throw in Polonius and Laertes and Ophelia as well in here. We could also think about what happens with that, and when it comes to royalty, right, which becomes quite a bloody affair, even if we think of the fact that King Richard II has had a hand in the murder of his own uncle, right? Who had helped to bring him up, and then we get the way that he rebukes and disrespects John of Gaunt, Hamlet and his father, of course. So that's a theme: the parents and their children, but especially fathers and daughters. If we went back to the beginning of A Midsummer Night's Dream and what that play does, it's fairly happy ending for the daughter in a father and daughter situation here. And again, this is where, people have tried to read Shakespeare, something autobiographical about Shakespeare, because he does seem to have left, he not even seemed to, he left most of his property to one of his daughters, almost completely cutting out his own wife from his will. Again, I want to hold at arm's length that tendency to read Shakespeare's life or biography into the plays as if he's using the play to write autobiography, which Emma Smith has warned us against as well. Emma Smith from Oxford, and you can look up those Oxford lectures online. They're free podcasts. So we get this back and forth between Prospero and Miranda, where he's asked her, do you remember before we got here? And she has this vague recollection of being waited on, and he basically tells Miranda that they have been exiled and stranded on this island through the corruption of his brother, who wanted to take over his kingdom and then align himself with Naples, so that Naples and Milan are the two kingdoms are together. And what Prospero says during this time is that what he was, yes, he was Duke of Milan, but he got too wrapped up in books. He got too wrapped up in what he calls the liberal arts. And particularly associated with the liberal arts here is magic, right? So we get these little moments in the text where it feels a little bit forced. I think the plot where Miranda keeps asking these questions back and forth. She says, "Well, why didn't they just kill us? Why did they exile us?" And Prospero says, "Well demanded, wench. My tale provokes that question." That feels like a little bit heavy-handed on the writer's point part there. Dear, they durst not, so dear the love my people bore me, nor set a mark so bloody on the business, but with colors fairer painted their foul ends. And few they hurried us aboard a bark, bore us some leagues to the sea, where they prepared a rotten carcass of a butt, not rigged, nor tackle, sail, nor mast. The very rats instinctively have quit it. And look at this reference. This is an important reference here. Miranda says, "How did we come here?" First she says, "Was I a burden to you?" And Prospero says, "No, you were great. You were the thing that kept me going." And then she says, "How came we ashore?" And Prospero says here, "By providence divine," right? That's that linear Euro-Christian history. That's a reference to perhaps a miracle or the breaking in of history, or that it was always planned through God's design to begin with. By providence divine, some food we had and some fresh water that a noble Neapolitan Gonzalo, out of his charity, who being then appointed master of this design, did give us with rich garments, linen stuffs, and necessaries, which since I have steeded much, so of his gentleness, knowing I loved my books, he furnished me from my own library with volumes that I prize above my dukedom. Now, the editors of the Broadview edition note that he shifts to the present tense, that he still prizes these books above his dukedom. And so there's this sense that later on in the play he's going to give up the his reliance on these books, but not quite yet. He still prizes them above being Duke of Milan. Now he's the Duke of Milan, and Gonzalo, notice he's a Neapolitan, right? So he's from Naples. And then there's the King of Naples, or the Duke of Naples, is going to play a part in here as well. And so Miranda says, "Would I might but ever see that man. Now I rise," says Prospero, "sit still and hear the last of our sea sorrow. Here in this island we arrived, and here have I, thy schoolmaster, made thee more profit than other princes can that have more time for vainer hours and tutors not so careful." So it's important, the theme of education in this play is that Prospero is kind of on top. He's the higher guy. He's kind of the stand-in for God. He's doing magical stuff, but he's taught Miranda and as his special tutor. Now, we're going to come back to that theme of education with Caliban, later on in the play. So just remember that. Miranda says, "Heavens, thank you for it. And now I pray you, sir, for still 'tis beating in my mind your reason for raising this sea storm. Know thus far forth, by accident most strange." So listen here. Prospero says, "Bountiful fortune, now my dear lady," so close to Fortuna, "hath mine enemies brought to this shore, and by my prescience I find my zenith doth depend upon a most auspicious star, whose influence, if now I court not, but omit, my fortunes will ever after drop. I am taking and seizing my moment with fortune, who is with me right now. Um, uh, Here cease more questions, thou were inclined to sleep. And so he basically hypnotizes, right? Um, uh, uh, um, his own daughter, right? So it's like, and like this is one of the things I want us to question, like, just like the kind of control that Prospero is showing here. And he has her fall asleep, and then he calls on Ariel. Now, some readers have thought of Ariel as a kind of super ego. He is kind of the higher moral being, as opposed to Caliban, that they're both foils, and that Prospero is somehow in between the two of them. You can make that of it what you want. I'm not doing a particularly psychoanalytic reading of the play. I'm pushing more towards an anti-colonialist one. Ariel comes in. "All hail, great master, grave sir, hail. I come to answer thy best pleasure, be it to fly, to swim, to dive into the fire, to ride on the curled clouds, to thy strong bidding task, Ariel, and all his quality." And Prospero says, "Hast thou, spirit, performed to the point the tempest that I bade thee?" So here we get that he did make the storm. Now Miranda's kind of been guessing around it, and she said, "What was your reason for raising the storm?" But Prospero refers to fortune there, right? That's what I'm trying to draw your attention to, is the kind of slippage. Is he being fully honest with Miranda? Is he hiding something about his powers? Clearly, with Ariel, he has a lot more design and calculation. Ariel says, "To every article, I boarded the king's ship. I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this." So if he did all of that, how can it exactly be fortune? Or is it just this reference to the stars, that by the reference to the stars, that Prospero knows that this is his moment to take what's his? And then, of course, his name Prosperity, right, being part of this as well. Prospero makes sure you haven't hurt anyone, and Ariel says, "No, of course not." He says that I've divided up the people. The king's son is on one part of the island, the others are on another, and he's put the sailors safely in the boat in a hidden place where the sailors are sleeping. And so now they have their chance to do all of this stuff. So if we think back to another theme that's throughout Shakespeare, is this theme of art, and who's putting on the art, who's putting on the play. Prospero, in some ways, is a grand stage director in this play. And we see that with Ariel's help, he's setting the stage for events that he wants to have happen. Now, is that what the liberal arts allows us to do through education? Does it allow us to shape destiny itself? I think that's one of the questions that The Tempest is asking us as a play. Notice that in Ariel's descriptions of what he does, that he says he has dispersed the rest of the fleet. So there wasn't only just one ship. There was a whole fleet of ships, and that they've dispersed, and he's brought the one ship to the island safely, but the rest of the fleet probably thinks the ship is lost. That's the source reference to the situation with that John Rolfe, who later marries Matawaka or Pocahontas, is on, right? So that the reference to the pamphlet of the shipwreck that I covered in my introductory lecture. This is a reference in real life. That would be a reference to the fleet that was led by Sir Francis Drake, from which that ship, the Sea Voyage, gets separated and then lands at Bermuda for several months, or one of the Bermudas. Yes, so Ariel says, the mariners all under hatches stowed, who with a charm joined to their suffered labor I have left asleep. And for the rest of the fleet, which I dispersed, they all have met again and are upon the Mediterranean float bound sadly home for Naples, supposing that they the king's ship wracked, and his great person perish. Keep going down here, and we see colonialism really emerging here. Ariel, Prospero says, Ariel, thy charge exactly is performed, but there's more work. What is the time of day? Past the mid-season, Prospero says, at least 2 glasses, or 2 turnings of the hourglass, so it's about 2 p.m. The time twixt 6 and now must by us both be spent most preciously. Ariel says, is there more toil? Since thou dost give me pains, let me remember thee, let me remind you, what thou hast promised, which is not yet performed me. How now, Moody? What is that? What is it thou canst demand? That's what Prospero asks. And Ariel says, my liberty. And so this is where we see directly in the play what has happened is there's this person who's become in service on this island to this other person, Prospero, who has his liberty at his charge. It's all up to Prospero. That is colonialism at work. It is an up-down image schema that is the product of a Euro-Christian worldview. And he can be let go at any time, but it has to be whenever Prospero gets to decide. He is sovereign. He is the one who makes the decision in the state of exception, if we were going to go back to Carl Schmitt's political theology there. And then Prospero's reaction here is to give Ariel a reminder of how he saved him. And so because he saved him from the witch Sycorax, that is why that's what indebts Ariel to Prospero. Now I want to mention a few things here that are important because of the ways people have read the Tempest. So the Bermudas, for example, so far as I know, and you can double check me on this, the Bermudas, I don't believe were populated by native people beforehand, which is unlike places like the island that Columbus named San Salvador. The native name was Guanahani, or the Taino name. And then he later names Hispaniola. So when Columbus comes into the islands, he immediately comes across people. In the Bermudas, I don't believe that there were native populations living in the Bermudas. They were just islands out there. If you find corrections on that, please let me know. But in other words, this fictional island that they're on doesn't seem to have had native inhabitants. That's very, very important. When Prospero gets there, what he meets is Sycorax. He meets Caliban, who's the descendant of Sycorax, who apparently has died, but she was exiled from Europe as well. And this conversation between Ariel and Prospero says that she was born in Algiers. She is associated with Moors or Muslims. So when we go back to the papal bulls of the 1400s and the so-called bulls of donation that give Spain and Portugal the right to go and enslave people from the northwest coast of Africa. That's what we're seeing. So when I need to nuance this a little bit. Northern Africa is controlled by the so-called Moors or by Islam. In the early 1490s, there's the Reconquista in Spain. And what that means is the reconquering of Spain. They pushed the Moors out across the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa. So while they are Muslims, they are enemies of Christ or Saracens. But what the Europeans start doing is they start going down the coast of West Africa, down below where the Islamic Empire necessarily had a hold. So the slaves that they are taking and the slave trade that they're initiating is kind of off the west coast of Africa and through the Canary Islands and there that they're controlling. And so Sycorax, being a witch from Algiers, is going to be associated with Moors and associated more so with something like the Middle East in the Euro-Christian conception than with the so-called New World. And that's important because she was exiled because apparently she was pregnant, and it was illegal to execute a witch who was pregnant because of the idea that it would destroy the life of the child within her. And so both Sycorax and Caliban, even if his name is an anagram for cannibal, are not natives. They're not indigenous to the islands or the Americas. So if you're figuring that imagination, what we're seeing is the superimposition of an entirely European and Mediterranean drama onto the Bermudas. That's really, really important because that drama gets mapped onto indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and what we now call South America over and over again through colonialist memoirs. It's more a sense of that they're bringing ideas about the world from their own past and then superimposing it onto cultures that have a completely different worldview. Prospero says, this blue-eyed hag, which the editors tell us could mean that she painted her eyelashes or her eyelids blue, or it could mean that she actually had blue eyes. This blue-eyed hag was hither brought with child, and here was left by the sailors. Thou, my slave, as thou reportst thyself, was then her servant, and for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands. So even Ariel as a spirit is imported to the island as the servant of Sycorax, the witch. And then she has her son Caliban on the island as well. Now, we get all sorts of readings that do associate Caliban with the ways Native people were treated under colonialism. And I think there's some good reason for doing that. But just very clearly, when we're thinking about what Shakespeare has imagined and what he has done at the level of the text of the play, is that this is and remains an entirely Eurocentric, dramatic situation. We will get some references later on in the play to things from the New World. And New World is always in quotes, by the way. And yes, Caliban, her son, says Ariel, and then we get Prospero's description. Dull thing, I say so, he that Caliban, whom now I keep in service. Thou best knowest what torment I did find thee in. Thy groans did make wolves howl and penetrate the breasts of ever angry bears. It was a torment to lay upon the damned, which Sycorax could not again undo. It was mine art when I arrived and had heard thee that made gape the pine and let thee out. So he seems to say that, to insinuate that Sycorax's powers weren't strong enough to get him back out of this tree that Ariel had been imprisoned in, but that Prospero somehow had better magic, more art than Sycorax, and was able to free him, but then immediately puts him into bondage to enslave him for his own service. Then we get the contrast from Ariel um, uh, to Caliban. Prospero wakes up Miranda, and he starts calling. He says, "Shake it off." He's telling her to wake up. "Shake it off. Come on. We'll visit Caliban, my slave, who never yields us a kind answer." So we know that the slavery situation from Ariel and Caliban, nobody likes to be enslaved, and that there's power being lorded over them. Uh, it is not a nice thing. It's not presented in a particularly nice way, with some sort of intention to profit them in some way. Prospero says, Miranda says, "'Tis a villain, sir, I do not love to look on. But as 'tis, we cannot miss him. He does make our fire, fetch in our wood, and serves in offices that profit us. What ho, slave Caliban, thou earth, thou speak." So Caliban is being associated over and over again with the earth, and Ariel is being associated with the sky, or the spirits of the sky. And so in the medical terminology and the humors of the body that are present in Shakespeare's time, there is some poetic figuration going on between the two slaves here as well. Nevertheless, they are both slaves. Ariel shows up, and we get a complete shift in tone of voice in the way that Prospero addresses him. "Fine apparition, my quaint Ariel, hearken thine ear." Prospero says, "Thou poisonous slave," now he's turning to Caliban, "thou poisonous slave, got by the devil himself upon thy wicked dams." He's referring to his mother as a kind of animal, so he's just the child of an animal. And we're starting to get that human-inhuman contrast. If we go back to the Valladolid debates that I mentioned from 1550 to 51 in my general introduction, that were debating whether or not native people in the so-called New World, or what we now call the Americas, whether or not they were fully human. And the Christian humanist version, remember, is that yes, they are. They have a seed of rationality, and they get treated like children because of that. And so that's a question that is showing up subtly in this text of the play, without any direct reference to those debates that had gone on in Spain just before Shakespeare was born. The first words, what we start getting from Caliban, at first he says, "You have enough wood. I don't need to do anything with you." But then he finally enters here, and he says, "I must eat my dinner. The island's mine by Sycorax, my mother, which thou takest from me." So he sees himself as the lord, the rightful lord of the island. When thou camest first, thou strokest me and made much of me. Wouldst give me water with berries in it, and teach me how to name the bigger light, and how less the burn by day and night. And then I loved thee, and showed thee all the qualities of the isle, the fresh springs, brine pits, barren place, and fertile. Cursed be I that did so. All the charms of Sycorax, toads, beetles, bats light on you, for I am all the subjects that you have. This is like, that's a really important line. I am all the subjects that you have. I am all of these things embodied as one slave. I am all the subjects that you have, which first was mine own king. And here you sty me in this hard rock, whilst you do the rest, keep from me the rest of the island. And then we get Prospero blaming in this very conventional narrative that we see later on throughout slavery, throughout racism, that the charge here is that Caliban was trying to rape Miranda, right? And that what Prospero must do is basically protect the white woman. Thou most lying slave, whom stripes may move, not kindness, I have used thee, filth as thou art, with human care. Again, remember that reference towards humanity, and lodged thee in mine own cell till thou didst seek to violate the honor of my child. Caliban, at this point, he just says, oh, would that it had been done. That didst prevent me. I had peopled else the isle with Caliban. So he seems to embrace that was his intention. Abhorred slave, says Miranda, which any print of goodness will not take, being capable of all ill. I pitied thee, took pains to make thee speak, taught thee each hour one thing or other, when thou didst not, savage. And savage just means a person of the woods here, but it takes on a harsher meaning slowly in the early 1600s in England. So sauvage in French, for example, just kind of means wooden people. But what we're seeing in that, with that word in the English language in the early to mid 1600s, is an increasingly negative connotation to the word savage, that we hear so much when Native Americans were referred to as savages. Even sports team names that take that kind of racist terminology and embrace it. Miranda says, know thine own meaning, but wouldst gabble like a thing most brutish. I endowed thy purposes with words that made them known, but thy vile race. And so we get an actual reference to race here. In early modern conceptions of race, it's not biological and it's not necessarily based on skin color yet, but that is emerging in this particular period. It has been emerging since the mid 1200s, or in some cases the late 1100s, through doctrines of purgatory, through the Crusades, which were depicting people who were darker in skin and tanned as being non-European, and privileging the north of England where people were paler. Of course, in earlier Rome, and when people are like Italian people have darker skin to begin with. And so we start getting these associations of whiteness and purity showing up in the late 1100s and mid 1200s. And that continues to move on. And then we get eventually, through an embracing of this idea of Christian civilizing onto the rest of the world, we get it being color coded in terms of skin color. So what we now know as skin color or skin toned racism is the product of the early modern period. It's not the same. It's not that people didn't have slaves or do other nasty things to each other before then, but slavery and the right to enslave people is tied to Christianity, which then developed a color code system that it mapped onto that idea of that some people are less Christian than others and they need to be civilized, or they're more infantile or childlike. That's all part of the Euro-Christian drama. That is the thing that is behind racism in terms of a skin color base. Now that idea of skin color changes throughout time and becomes more biological in the 19th century. And so there's these ideas of whiteness, for example, shift throughout time. It's not always static, but what we see in the early modern era just after this, and in about 1640s in the colonies in New England, is you get where you start seeing the first laws that are based on the tone of people's skin. It's always associated with who's a Christian and who is not, and how to keep track of slaves, because the darker their skin, the easier to tell that they're right off a slave. We get a reference to race here, but this is just a vile race. There isn't much of a reference to Caliban's skin color here. It's interesting how people choose to depict him. There's a BBC version of the play I watched the other night from about 1980, and Caliban is very hairy. He's looked as an ape, and so we get that mapping of the Euro-Christian evolutionary almost trajectory sort of superimposed on that version of the character. Now, we have had people with different skin color in other Shakespeare plays, in Othello, in Titus Andronicus. So people do notice at the time period, but we don't start having the kind of hierarchical Christianizing impulse that we get in terms of modern race politics. That's still emergent at the time period. Now, people who were non-Christian were able to be enslaved. Saracens, Muslims. We know this from the papal bulls, right? So it's the non-Christian first that determines somebody not being civilized. And then we get skin color based racism sort of being superimposed within that Euro-Christian dynamic, historically speaking. And so, basically Miranda has been saying, I was acting like little Prospero. I was teaching you your words, just like he taught me. He was my tutor, and then I was teaching you. So we get that Euro-Christian worldview of man on top, woman being a little bit lesser, being a little bit closer to nature, children and nature and indigenous peoples being treated as less rational, but perhaps capable of learning. And so the woman teaches the child, or the native person who's closer to nature, who knows how things work. And he's the one, as Caliban says, I'm the one who knew how nature worked on this island before you even came here, right? All superimposed into this Euro-Christian up-down image schema or hierarchy that naturalizes itself. And the liberal arts is going to be put at the top of that. So that's why we want to keep that question of the liberal arts and what they do for us central to the ways that we're thinking about this play, because the secular humanist line, or the way that they're going to teach Shakespeare, according to that, is going to say that this is actually a good thing. It's like, oh yeah, maybe there's a little bit of racism or something in it, but actually what I'm trying to say is that from a perspective that analyzes this from the Euro-Christian, using Euro-Christian as an analytic category, so we're not as a religion. Instead, we're using Euro-Christian as one word, lowercase, as a social movement. What we see is that even the liberal arts and education and this whole civilizing mission is entirely embedded with a gender hierarchy, is entirely embedded with what becomes a racial on the basis of skin color hierarchy, and with who's a Christian and who is not. That's what Euro-Christianity, what we mean by Euro-Christian worldview. The editors of the Broadview edition say that race during this period could suggest natural qualities passed along by a way of a family bloodline. It could also designate collective ethnic differences, though it did not take on a full sense of biological categorization until the 19th century. So we want to know that these categories of race and skin color, these things change over time. They're not static and transcendent, but they sometimes get treated as so. Then we do get an interesting reference from Caliban around line 376 in Act 1.2. And there's a reference to his mother's god, um, uh, Setebos or Setebos, who is a reference to a Patagonian figure. I don't use the term deity because, again, when we impose Euro-Christian language like God or deity onto indigenous peoples of Turtle Island or North and South America, then we're already doing that colonizing thing. They might have entities, all sorts of entities, but once we start using Christian language of soul, God, all of that stuff, then we're imposing cultural concepts from Europe onto the so-called New World. So this is a reference. What's interesting about the reference here is that the only way Shakespeare could have gotten that term, Setebos, is from Magellan's voyages, which would have been 1519 to 22. So that is where we get a first reference to this entity from the people at the southern tip of South America. So we see that Shakespeare's drawing on that. On around line 389, there's a reference to Chanticleer. And I think this is a general figure, but the editors of the Broadview edition, if you have this, they are referring to it showing up, Chanticleer being a singing rooster in Chaucer's The Nun's Priest's Tale. I just wanted to throw that in there because there aren't we don't often go directly from Shakespeare to Chaucer in references, but that's just interesting that he would be referring back to that. I generally think of Chanticleer as a general rooster figure, maybe not only tied to Chaucer from that time period. So we get Prospero has made Caliban obey, and then we get Ferdinand and Ariel coming in with Ariel playing music, and he's kind of doing this hypnotic suggestion almost, right? So it's really interesting how the unconscious is not an idea. That's an idea that Sigmund Freud makes more definite for our era, but that we can see something like that going on with animal magnetism, with basically what we now call hypnosis, with Miranda, and with what Ariel is doing with Ferdinand here by singing songs and suggesting almost to his unconscious what may have happened to his father. Then we flip back to Miranda and Prospero, who are looking on Ferdinand. Of course, Miranda seems to fall star-crossed, immediately love at first sight with Ferdinand, and likewise with him. The reference to love at first sight happens at line 445. They have, at the first sight, they have changed eyes, says Prospero. But there's also this sense that Prospero has designed he's staged the whole situation where these young people are going to fall in love and get married. That's going to unite Milan and Naples. It's going to help him come back into his political life away from his time being embedded in books and the liberal arts. So we get the loving exchange between Ferdinand and Miranda, not knowing if they're real at first, if she's a goddess, and they quickly fall in love with each other. Then Prospero is kind of at least playing the part of the angry father to kind of keep them apart, but at the same time, aside, he's orchestrating the whole thing. Around line 480, Prospero says, "Silence, one word more shall make me chide thee." He's talking to Miranda. "If not hate thee." What, an advocate for an impostor? Hush. Thou thinkst there's no more such shapes as he, having seen but him and Caliban. Foolish wench, to the most to the most of men this is a Caliban, and they to him are angels. So look at the way that he's taking, but to most men this is pretty easy. He's doing this kind of structuring of the way people might look and be in society, and how high and how noble they might be. And Miranda says, my affections are most humble then, because I just want this guy, right? There's a nice, if you do have the Broadview edition, there's a nice reference to anima, or to animal spirits, or what we might call nerves, or the nervous system, or the electricity of the nervous system, or animal magnetism later on. There's a nice little reference on page 92 of the text. Then we get, this is all, this is going to take us to the end of Act 1 here, right? So Prospero is talking to Ariel again, and he says that they've still got a lot more to do. But he has said around 499-ish, Prospero says, it works. And then to Ferdinand, he says, come on. And then to Ariel, he says, thou hast done well, fine Ariel, follow me. Hark what thou else shalt do me. And so again, I want to think back, just as we end this act, to remind us about A Midsummer Night's Dream. In a lot of ways, Prospero is kind of seeming like Oberon, right? Oberon is, of course, the kind of double of Theseus in Athens, in the city, but Oberon is the king of the spirits, or the elves, right, out in the forest. And we're on this kind of enchanted island where Prospero is the king of everything and orchestrating things as well. So we see, at least with Shakespeare's style, the idea of composite characters showing up and developing. Like we kind of saw Richard II as an earlier version of Hamlet. And I mentioned that Stephen Greenblatt traced that in his wonderful scholarship on Shakespeare. But we see that this is part of Shakespeare's style as an author, is that he's working with, like, many times the same kinds of characters, but situating them differently, as almost like different players on a chessboard or something like that. So we'll see this with other figures like Trinculo, who is a jester type figure. And we didn't read King Lear this summer, but there's the jester in King Lear. But also we could look at the grave diggers in Hamlet. We could go back to them as well. And even that scene with Hamlet and the skull of the jester, right, where he's sort of comparing himself, because there is, if we remember from the Richard II contextualized readings, that there is in the King's Two Bodies book by Ernst Kantorowicz, there is a way to think of the king and the jester as the same type of figure, the same type of character, so that a complex character like Hamlet can play both at once or both at different times. And also the intriguer, the person in the middle. So what Hamlet is able to do is kind of, he moves throughout different sort of class valences, if you will. And so that just seems to be a mark of what Shakespeare does as a writer. We'll continue on with Act 2 in another contextualized reading. As always, thanks for paying attention. If you're my students, you can feel free to email me and ask me questions directly. Have a great day.